Alright, hello everybody and welcome to my second of 3 videos on the Canon EOS Rebel T1i, also called the 500D or the KISS X3 in different markets. In the first video we talked about what everything on the camera was. In this video I'm going to show you how to do everything except the menu system, which we'll cover in video 3. So, first thing is, this being a digital camera, we can do nothing whatsoever without a fresh battery. So let's make sure we have one. To remove the battery, you just open the battery chamber door on the bottom, and then there's a little lever off to the side that you push out of the way, and you can remove the battery. This uses a Canon LP-E5 rechargeable battery, and this is a third-party aftermarket version. I'm not sure if Canon still makes these new or not. I honestly don't know, but the third-party versions are just fine. Slide it into the chamber until it clicks, and that little lever will cover it. Close the battery door, and if it works, we'll turn the camera on. There we go. It works, it's just almost out of charge. Let me go get a different one. Okay, so when we turn it on, the screen's going to turn on with our current configuration and give us some information. The most important, which for us right now, was checking to make sure that the battery was good. Next thing we're going to do is talk about memory cards for this camera. Once you have a battery in it, you can start taking photos, right? Well, no, we need to save them someplace. To access the memory cards, we simply push this door open, push it out to the back of the camera and flip it open, and then we insert a memory card right there. The memory cards are inserted as the diagram on the door shows, and an easy way to remember it is that the sticker with the text faces the back of the camera. Push it in, click it in place, shut the door, and now we're ready to go. That's a 32 gig memory card that's going to hold 5,800. This has got to be set to JPEG. That's a lot of photos. So anyway, this camera can accept SDHC memory cards up to 32 gigabytes. It is not compatible with SDXC memory cards, and so that means anything 64 gigabytes and up will not work. At least that's what everything online said. I don't have a 64 gig, maybe I do. Let's find out. I do have an SDXC over here. SDXC 128 gigs. See what happens. It doesn't like that one bit. So I think we can call that confirmed. It is not going to use SDXC. It's going to use SDHC cards, and it will be quite happy with that. Next thing we're going to talk about, now that we have a memory card in there and a battery, and we can start doing things with this camera soon, is how to change lenses. Being an APS-C DSLR from Canon, this can take two different kinds of lenses. We hinted at in the very beginning of the video. You can take EF lenses that mount here and EFS lenses that mount here. EFS lenses have a white square for the mounting index. Coincidence? I think not. EF lenses have a red dot for the mounting index. Again, not coincidence. If you're going to mount an EF lens like this, you line up red dot to red dot. If you're going to mount an EFS lens, you mount white square to white square. Other than that, the process is exactly the same. Put it in, rotate it clockwise until it clicks into place, and you've mounted a lens. To remove it, you push the lens release button, turn it counter or anti-clockwise until it stops, and you can now put a different lens on. Very simple, very easy to use process, and you have the flexibility of both EF and EFS lenses. Next up, let's talk a little bit about how to use the flash. This camera has both a pop-up flash on the camera. Love doing that. And it also has a flash hot shoe. There's no PC port, so your only way to control the flash on this camera is with the hot shoe or the pop-up flash, and to use either an RF trigger in the hot shoe, or to use either a flash here or the pop-up flash to trigger other flashes with a flash when they fire based on a previous flash, using a flash trigger. So the camera's flash sync speed was 1/200th of a second, and what that means is that the way that the shutter on a camera works is that the first curtain opens, and then the second curtain follows behind it, and then they reset. In this camera they actually move up and down, but I can't comfortably do that with my hands, so just pretend. So the first curtain opens. It stays open for approximately 1/200th of a second. The flash triggers right during then. Second curtain closes, and then they reset just like that. All right, so that's the fastest shutter speed you can use. You can use slower shutter speeds for your flash. Let's say you're at 1/8 of a second. First curtain opens, entire sensor is exposed to light for about 1/8 of a second. Second curtain closes, reset. But what if you're at 1/4000th of a second? The first curtain's going to open, and then the second curtain's going to come in right behind it. And there's just going to be a very thin little slit between the first and second curtain as they travel. And a standard flash is not going to work. A high-speed sync, I believe some of these speed lights will work in a high-speed sync with this camera. I don't have any of those, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, which is just teaching some of the basics here. But the point is that with a standard flash setup, 1/200th of a second is the fastest shutter speed you can use. And because your shutter speeds are not controlled by how quickly the shutter curtains move, but by how much time elapses between when the first one starts its travel and the second one starts its travel behind it. I do have some tips to help you get the most out of your flash use. Whether you are using your pop-up flash right here, or taking a standard flash and putting it into your hot shoe like this, the worst possible place you can put a flash is right on top of your lens. That's because the light from the flash leaves like a wall, reaches your subject, bounces back to your lens, and what's going to happen is your subjects will look very flat and waxy and have, if you don't have red eye reduction on, bright glowing red eyes. In all, not a great look. So when you use a flash, a really good idea is to use the flash to mimic the way that we see things, to mimic real lighting. If you think about when you're outside talking to someone, the sun is above them. Or at night, if you're standing under a street light, the light, again, is above them. If you're indoors talking to a colleague and you have lights in the ceiling, they're above you. The human mind is wired to see something lit from above as being natural and flattering. So we want to replicate that with our flash. The easiest way to do that is by getting a tilting flash that you can use to point the flash up at the ceiling and have the light from the flash bounce off the ceiling and go back down to your subject before going back to your sensor. And that will use the flash to replicate the natural overhead lighting that we're used to. What if you don't have a ceiling? Well, the next thing you can also get flashes that have a swiveling head. So in addition to tilting, it can swivel. So you can bounce that flash off of a wall and come close to replicating that overhead lighting. That's really the best thing you can do, is get a swiveling and tilting flash. And then it's okay to put it above your flash here because you're going to be bouncing it off of a wall or the ceiling. There's another thing you can do. If you get a wireless adapter for your flash, put one on your camera and one on your flash, you can hold your flash wherever you want. And then you have the ability to sculpt the light exactly as you want it to look. You can hold the flash off to the side, point it at the ceiling, whatever you would like to do. That's a very powerful use of flash to make the flash be sculpt the light as you would like it to. And on that last note, because this is an autofocus camera, you can set it into autofocus mode, and you can hold the flash, and then the only button you ever need to push is the shutter release button, because you're going to be able to focus with the shutter half depressed, and then the camera will take its photo when you push the shutter button. So let's start digging into some of the specifics about how to use this camera. I'm going to start here on the top. On-off button, pretty self-explanatory. ISO button allows you to pull up the ISO on the back of the camera and pick the sensitivity to light that you would want to use, anything from auto to 3200 with the way I have it set up right now. I thought there was a high plus on this. I could be mistaken. Anyway, those points covered. Now let's talk about this dial right here. This is the mode dial, and this controls your shooting modes. There's a lot of them. Canon jam-packs their entry-level cameras with shooting modes. We're going to start right here with this green box, which is the magical green box, or it's actually, I think, called full program auto, something like that. Anyway, what the green box means is that the camera is going to do all the thinking for you. It'll raise the flash if it wants to. It'll select the shutter speed and aperture. And I think it might also be able to select its own ISO. Yeah, in full auto, you can't even specify the ISO. The camera's going to pick the best one for you, or what it thinks is the best one. So basically, with Green Box, what you're doing is telling your DSLR, just work like a cell phone. We're going to go all the way here to the top of the dial next and start explaining these modes over here. These are scene modes, and they have a set of preset parameters for different scenes. These are your creative modes, I think is what Canon calls them. Basically what this does is give you some control over different settings. And honestly, if you have come to DSLRs so that you can learn how to do photography better, these are the modes where you want to live. These are the modes you want to ignore. Okay. A-DEP is called automatic depth of field or something to that effect. Basically what this does is this takes your autofocus points and your aperture, and you set a small aperture and you line up your subjects along your autofocus points, and you can then have them staggered from close to far, and your camera, I take that back, your camera will pick the best aperture. So let's say you have a subject here that's at this autofocus point 5 feet from your lens, and a subject here that's at this autofocus point that's 10 feet, and then a couple more that are spanning them from the diagonal. Okay, your camera will figure out, with your distance to the subjects and their distance from the camera, what aperture to use to get them all in focus. That's what A-DEP does. Manual is full manual. In manual mode, you control the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, everything, and if the photo turns out, that's because you did your job well. If the photo doesn't turn out, the camera's going to let you make a mistake anyway. It's just going to do what you tell it to. So with manual mode, when we'll turn it on here, I'm going to adjust the command wheel and I can adjust the shutter speed. If I want to adjust the aperture, I hold down not the asterisk, I hold down the AV button, and now I can adjust the aperture on the lens. So shutter speed, aperture, just like that. And you can see by where the box moves when I push the button which parameter it's going to let me control. AV stands for Aperture-priority, and you control the aperture with the command wheel in this mode. What this does is you select the aperture, and then the camera is going to look at your ISO and your lighting and your scene and figure out the best shutter speed. So you have control over every parameter except for the shutter speed with this. And you do control the shutter speed indirectly by picking the aperture that you want to use. Aperture-priority is where I spend most of my time when I'm doing photography. I find it personally to be a really good creative mode because I'm very focused on what kind of depth of field I want for most of my images. Shutter priority is the same but the opposite. The command wheel here controls the shutter speed. You control the scene, the ISO, the lighting if you can, and then the camera will pick the best aperture based on the shutter speed you tell it you're going to use. Program mode, you can select the ISO and you can program shift, but you cannot select the shutter speed or aperture. The camera is going to select both of those. What do I mean program? Oops, program shift. So in program mode, the camera is going to select your shutter speed and aperture, and it's going to give you a proper exposure. But if you hold down the AV button, you can force the camera to overexpose or underexpose up to 2 stops in either direction in third stop increments. So that gives you the ability to shift your exposure just a little bit to either be high key and bright or low key and dark as needed for your specific photo. We're going to go to the screen here for CA mode. I forget what CA stands for, creative something or another. But basically what this is going to let you do is adjust. It's basically program mode with some parameter adjustments. And I'm trying to remember how to do that. This function is not selectable in, okay, thank you. Why isn't this, oh, set, Q button. Haha, I need the Q button. Set. Set allows me to change the buttons. Okay, we can control the flash type. We hit set and now we use the command wheel to select what kind of flash we would like. Command pad down. Now we can select the background going from sharp background to blurry background. Exposure, very bright to very dark. Creative control mode, we can do standard, smooth skin tone, vivid blues and greens, monochrome image. So these are your 4 options. We'll go down here, single shot, continuous, self-timer with remote, or self-timer continuous. And those are the parameters we can adjust in CA mode. So basically think of CA mode as program with some creative control. And basically what you want to do is go in here to whatever you want to adjust them and go with it. Next up here, we have portrait mode. Portrait mode is going to give you a shallow depth of field with a decent subject to background isolation to set this up for success. If you're using your kit zoom lens or something like this 28 to 80, use the long end of that lens, like your kit 18 to 55, shoot at 55. Also try to have about 9 to 10 feet between your subject and the background, and that will help with subject background isolation and also with having a nice blurry background. This next mode is called landscape, and this is best with wide-angle lenses, and it aims for a deep depth of field. So with your kit 18 to 55 zoom, set it at 18 millimeters, and then this will try to make everything from right in front of the lens to the beginning of space and time be in focus. This next mode that has the flower is called close-up. Close-up works best with macro lenses, but if you're using the long end of your kit zoom of 55 millimeters, that's okay too. And this is going to aim for a deep depth of field and a focus point that is as close as your lens can focus. Sports, sometimes called action, is ideal with a telephoto lens, or if you have your 18 to 55, that 55. If you have this something like the 70 to 200, set it to 200. This uses the central autofocus points only and attempts to freeze action that's in the center of the frame by using a fast shutter speed and large aperture. Night portrait is a very specific setting. It is best with a wider lens and a tripod, and it's best for people who are within 5 meters of the camera. What this does is it shoots the camera on full auto. It delivers a longer exposure, and specifically the setting that this is used for is, let's say you're walking across a bridge at night with a friend, and there's a cityscape in the background, and you're like, oh, this would be an awesome photo if my friend was lit up and we could see the city in the background. So you set the camera on a tripod or someplace where it won't fall into the river, like don't set it on the edge of the bridge, but someplace secure. Have your friends stand in front of the cityscape, tell them, don't move until I tell you, and use this mode. What this will do is this will fire the flash, I believe at the beginning of the exposure, to illuminate your friend, and then have a long exposure that's open after that to allow the lights from the city to be visible as well. So your friend will be illuminated, and then the lights of the city behind them will be in the image. If your friend moves as soon as the flash is fired, then what's going to happen is that the lights that are behind your friend will shine through them. That's why it's important for your friend to know not to move until after the photo's taken and you tell them to move. This next mode is no flash, and this is basically program mode where the flash is turned off. And then movie mode, and this will allow you to record movies on your camera. We're going to go to the back of the camera, and we're going to talk about what all of the buttons on the back of the camera do. Up here, menu, what this does is this opens the menu, and we're going to go through all of the menu items on this camera in video 3. Display turns the display on and off. That's its one job, nothing else. AV we covered. In full manual shooting, you use this to adjust your aperture. In semi-automatic or the other modes, program, Aperture-priority, and Shutter-priority, you hold this down and adjust the command wheel to exposure compensate to overexpose and underexpose your images like that. The asterisk button up here has some different uses, and we're going to talk about this in video 3 because there's a whole menu item dedicated to how this functions. Your autofocus point selection button will allow you to select your autofocus points, and it allows you to scroll from the camera picks the best one to you select a specific autofocus point. Okay, so what's this useful for? Let's say, for instance, that you're at a sporting event and you know that your son or daughter are playing soccer, and the goal's going to be over here, and they're going to be running in from this way. If you set this autofocus point and get your son or daughter on that autofocus point and just burst mode as they kick the goal, then you can have them in focus as the ball's going into or toward the goal over here. If you're shooting in portrait mode orientation, you could put your subject's face up here and get if you have 5 or 10 or 50 portrait subjects, you could get all of their faces up here and have them all be in focus equally. So another way to control the autofocus, by the way, is to use the cross pad, and when you want to go back to auto, hit set twice, once to get to the middle and then once to turn them all back on. So there's a couple different ways to control your autofocus point selection. This button here is live view, and what that does is this turns on the camera's live view. There we go, feature, and you can see what the camera sees. Just to prove that it's actually working, there you go. You can also shoot from live view mode, so you can take photos. If you're using live view for something like star trails or macro photography or microscopy, you can manually focus in live view, and when you have your focus and you're happy with it, just take your photo straight from live view. Next button we're going to talk about is this one right here. It's your drive mode button. So we're going to start on this side, single shot. If you hold down the shutter button, you can hold it down until the end of time. It will only take one photo. In order to do this, you have to release the shutter button each time you want to take another photo. Continuous will continue to take photos at 3.4 frames per second until you underrun the buffer, so long as you hold the shutter button down. Self-timer with remote control. If you have a remote control, this will use a self-timer. Self-timer for 2 seconds. If you have the self-timer activated, this will last for 2 seconds. Self-timer continuous. This will be continuous shooting with a self-timer, either in between each one or leading up to it. I forget which. We're going to set this on 4 and see what happens. So it's a self-timer that then leads into 4 continuous shots. White balance is this button right up here on the top. So here are your white balance options. Auto white balance, daylight, which is full sun, shade, when you're in the shade of a building or a tree or something like that, cloudy, for when it's cloudy outside, tungsten, for when you're underneath tungsten light, which is a warm incandescent light, fluorescent, for under fluorescent lighting, flash, and custom. Okay, shade. Basically, when you're in the shade, it cools down the light temperature, makes it a little bit more blue. So the camera adds a little bit of yellow to compensate for that. If we click OK, it takes us there to shade. Then cloudy is a little bit less blue than is shade because you're still getting sun coming through the clouds. Tungsten light is very warm. So if you've seen Edison light bulbs, for instance, those are tungsten if they have the filament in them and not the LEDs, and those make a warm yellow to nearly orange light. So this adds a lot of blue to compensate for that. Fluorescent lighting is very green, so this adds magenta to offset the green. Flash bulbs are xenon, and those create a very blue light, so this adds some yellow to counteract that. And then custom allows you to take a photo and create a custom white balance. So what's that good for? Well, let's say that you are doing a tabletop photography setup with a white backdrop. What you can do is set up your white backdrop, get all of your lights set up, and then take a photo for your custom white balance. Then the camera will know that what it's looking at is supposed to be white, and it will do whatever adjustments are needed to the parameters to make sure that that white backdrop is white. Now, anytime you go up to your tabletop studio, set up the lights the same way, use your custom white balance, and you'll know that every photo you take for that day will have the same white balance. And what this will do is when you're editing your raw files, especially your raw files, this will save you a lot of time in post because you won't accidentally have color shifting happening between photos. The next button we're going to look at is the autofocus button over here, and you have 3 options: one shot, AI focus, and AI servo. Okay, what does this mean? One shot is for still subjects like portraits or buildings. The camera will obtain focus when you have pressed the shutter button, and then it will hold that focus until you release the shutter button or take the photo. AI focus switches between single and servo based on what the camera thinks that the scene needs. So in this mode, the camera is going to pick the best focus mode and go with that. AI Servo is suitable for moving subjects like sports players or pets, and what this does is the camera will track motion as it moves through the scene, so that if somebody's running towards you or across your frame, once they're in focus, the camera will do its best to track them. This bottom button right here is called Picture Adjuster, and this brings up a bunch of different presets that you can use to adjust things in your photos. Okay, Standard is just the standard coloration. It's pretty much neutral. Portrait enhances your settings to optimize for portraits. Landscape does that, but for landscapes. Natural makes your images look a little bit more natural. Faithful tries to reproduce colors faithfully. Monochrome makes everything black and white. User. What you can do with these is you can go into them and set specific parameters, which we're not going to do right here because there's no button to do it. I think that these are adjusted in Video 3. I can't remember. Anyway, the reason I can't remember is I don't use these, and I strongly recommend also not using them either. The reason for that is that this camera is more than a decade old at this point. The algorithms used to calculate all this are not as strong as what you can do in post on any computer, including with a free photo editing software. So I would suggest picking standard, natural, or faithful's okay. Standard is really fine. It's good for these cameras. Just stick with this and do all of your color, contrast, and so forth manipulation in post. You'll get better images and have better results if you do it that way. Okay, so now that we've seen how all of these other functions work, let's see what happens if we just push the Set button. The Set button from the screen gives us access to change everything on here except the image mode. Shutter priority is fixed by the dial up here, so we're kind of locked into that. But we can adjust the shutter speed. If we are in aperture priority, we could adjust the aperture. If we are in manual, we could adjust both of these. ISO, we can adjust again with the aperture, with the command wheel up here. We can overexpose or underexpose our images from here. We can do flash compensation, overclock or underclock our flash from here. We can change our color toning mode. We can change our white balance setting. Our metering mode right here we can change. We have evaluative, partial, and spot metering, and center weighted. So since this is how we get into metering, let's talk about what these different metering modes are. Evaluative uses all of the information from the scene, in color, contrast, and I think also distance perhaps, to evaluate what's in front of the camera and give you the best exposure for that scene. Partial metering uses a smaller part of the metering area, but as far as I know, it works in the same or a similar manner as evaluative. Spot metering uses a small spot, and I believe that this is autofocus point linked, I believe, with this camera. If I'm incorrect about that, someone will correct me in the comments section. But what this does is use a very tiny part of the image metering area to complete 100% of your metering information. And center weighted, what that does is use an area in the center of your frame about like this to calculate the majority of your metering information, and then the balance of your metering comes from outside of that area. So for general shooting, evaluative and center weighted are both very good options. Canon's evaluative metering is very good. So even though this camera is long in the tooth, their evaluative metering function on this will be top notch. Here we can adjust the image size and coarseness, compression. So we've got RAW plus large JPEG, RAW only. And you can see as we adjust it, the image size and how many we can fit onto the SD card here. Fine resolution large JPEG, coarse resolution large, fine resolution medium, coarse medium, fine small, coarse small. If you are using Windows 10 and newer, the RAW files from this camera will thumbnail in your file explorer, so you don't need to use a JPEG to have a thumbnail as well. There's no reason to use RAW plus JPEG with this camera anymore. Just use RAW and buy yourself 300 extra photos on your 32 gig SD card. AI focus we can change between the 3 AI modes, and then our shooting mode we can change between the different shooting modes. So there we go. And that is what we can adjust in this menu with the set button. Once we have some photos, we can hit the play button and we can scroll through them to see what photos we have on the camera, and we can even delete them from here if we would like to do that as well. So let's take everything that we've seen here and put it together and take a photo with this camera. We've got it on, we've got a lens mounted, battery, SD card. You're going to select what mode you want to use. You're going to get your configuration set up in the back, your ISO, your autofocus mode, all of that stuff you're going to set up ahead of time, which is why we've done it before we got here. Once you have all of that set up, all you have to do is look through the viewfinder in the back of your camera and take a photo once you are comfortable with the framing of your image. It's that simple. The logic of this camera, and the logic of the Rebel cameras in general, is that you do all your setup ahead of time, and then you generally have a few different settings at most that you change from time to time, and then you focus on composing and taking your photo with the settings that you've already set up. And that is everything that we had to cover in this second video. So if you want to know what's in the menus, come back for the third video and we'll go over everything in the menu video.